In the moments before a plane crashes, a small, indestructible recording device called a black box captures the final moments from the cockpit. The tragic nature of these recordings are as devastating as they are intriguing. They remind us of how fragile our lives can be and how lucky we are to be alive in a dangerous world. What I am about to show you might be quite sensitive, so take care as we go through a list of the 7 most chilling last words that capture panic, confusion, and sometimes acceptance from the pilots of some of the world's most infamous crashes. Number 7. Delta Airlines Flight 1141, full power. The crash of the Delta Airlines 1141 was completely avoidable, and it is one of those few moments where some of the major culprits were the pilots themselves. Delta Airlines Flight 1141 was a regularly scheduled service from Jackson, Mississippi to Salt Lake City, Utah, with a stopover in Dallas, Texas. On the 31st of August 1988, the pilots of the Delta Airlines Boeing 727 spent their pre-flight schedule discussing some recent airline accidents and joking around about leaving something funny on their plane's black box just in case they crashed.
Oh, is that what they look for?
Yeah, you know that Continental that crashed in Denver? Did you read that in the news?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, they were talking about dating habits of one of the flight attendants. Had a real nice laugh, you know. We gotta leave something for our wife and children to listen to.
A couple of minutes later, that harmless banter would self-fulfill when their flight failed to become airborne just seconds after takeoff, and it would crash back down into a field, bursting into flames and killing 14 of the 108 people on board. Upon investigation, it was found that the pilots had been distracted by their off-topic conversation and forgot to configure their plane properly for takeoff. The black box reveals the off-topic and tone-deaf conversations the pilots were having. You can hear the first officer leading the jokes, one of the crew responding, and the captain chipping in before panic sets in and he screams full power just before the crash. Number 6. Polish Air Force 101. Fucking hell. How many times do you hear that the president of a sovereign nation lost his life to a plane crash? Well, that's what makes this particularly tragic. Popularly referred to as the Smolensk air disaster, the official presidential plane of Poland was on its way from a memorial of a tragic event called the Katyn Massacre when it crashed. On board this plane was Poland's sitting president, Lech Kaczynski, his wife Maria, the former president of Poland in exile, Richard Kaczorowski, the chief of the Polish General Staff and some other senior Polish military officers, the president of the National Bank of Poland, Polish government officials, 18 members of the Polish parliament, senior members of the Polish clergy, and relatives of victims of the Katyn massacre. Needless to say, it was an indescribable loss. So, what caused the plane to crash? You could blame the pilots, the weather, or both, because investigations into the crash found nothing particularly wrong with the plane itself. The pilots were attempting to land at a former military airbase in thick fog, but visibility was reduced to about 500 meters, 1,600 feet. So they chose to descend the aircraft far below the normal approach path, which caused it to hit a couple of trees, tip, invert, and crash into the ground. There were no survivors. Amidst the countless conspiracy theories that sprung up after the crash, investigators maintained that it was the crew's fault. The Air Force unit was disbanded, and many high-ranking members of the Polish military resigned. If anything, the recordings from the aircraft's black box reveals how frightened the pilots were. If this was truly an assassination attempt, the last words from the cockpit wouldn't be the F word.
Terrain ahead. Terrain ahead. Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
Ready, lock body.
Pull up.
Control, we're going to take it
Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
Number 5. It's the end. August 12th, 1985 was a terrible day in Japan. On this day, the country experienced what would become the worst air accident involving a single aircraft and the second deadliest accident in aviation history. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Haneda Airport in Tokyo, Japan. The flight, which departed from Tokyo en route to Osaka, was doomed just 12 minutes into its journey, and from that point, it took only 30 minutes before the aircraft met a ghastly fate in the mountains. Minutes after takeoff, the aircraft suffered a sudden, explosive decompression. This resulted in the loss of the rudder and hydraulic systems, effectively crippling the pilot's control over the aircraft. The reason for the crash was later determined to be a faulty repair after an incident 7 years earlier. Despite this, the crew managed to keep the plane airborne for another half hour before it finally crashed. The Boeing 747 was carrying 524 passengers, including crew members, and only 4 of the 524 passengers survived the deadly crash. Many of the passengers survived the initial crash, but Japanese forces waited too long to carry out a rescue mission, so many died while they waited. The last words from this flight, although spoken in Japanese, signified that the pilots had lost all hope as they waited for the inevitable to happen. All hydraulics failed. It's the end. Number 4. PSA Flight 182. Ma, I love you. On the 25th of September 1978, America suffered 2 catastrophic fronts. A passenger airplane Boeing 727 collided into a Cessna plane flown by a student pilot and crashed down into a North Park residential neighborhood. The plane hit the ground roughly at a busy intersection, and flying debris struck numerous homes. 144 people in the plane and on the ground were killed. It was terrible. There were reports of body parts strewn about the neighborhood and fires everywhere. It would take several years for that neighborhood to recover, but those who live there now say that it has never returned to normal since the accident. So what caused the collision? It turns out many factors led to the crash, and almost everyone, except the innocent civilians on the ground, had a role to play in the crash that happened. First, it was discovered that the PSA flight crew failed to follow proper air traffic control procedures when the crew lost sight of the Cessna plane and failed to alert the air traffic control on the ground. Members of the air traffic control also cut corners instead of following due process, and the Cessna pilots changed course last minute and failed to notify the air traffic control of their course change. In the last moments on PSA Flight 182, you can hear the fear and horror in their voices. And although these words were lost in the noise, the pilot's last words were, "Ma, I love you."
seconds. The tone, the time.
We're going down. This is PSA. Okay, we'll call equipment for you.
Number 3. We are going to invert. When the Aero Peru Flight 603 took off in the early hours of October 2nd, 1996, no one thought it would crash because the plane was in good condition. The pilots were experienced and the weather was great, but just minutes after takeoff, the flight crew began to realize that their basic flight instruments were behaving erratically. Aero Peru Flight 603 was a scheduled flight from Miami International Airport to Comodoro Arturo Merino Benitez International Airport in Santiago, Chile. But because of this emergency, they requested an immediate return to the airport. Flying over water at night with no visual references, the pilots were unaware of their true altitude and struggled to navigate the aircraft. Because of this, the aircraft stalled multiple times and rapidly lost altitude, and before they knew it, the plane's left wingtip struck water. The experienced pilots were miraculously able to keep the plane airborne again for 22 seconds, but unfortunately, the plane inverted and crashed into the water, killing all 70 people on board. The investigation discovered later that the air data computers were unable to show correct airspeed and altitude due to an error made by maintenance. A maintenance worker had failed to remove a tape covering on the pitot static system ports on the aircraft exterior. On the black box, investigators would find the ominous yet professional exclamation of a pilot still fighting to keep his passengers alive. We are going to invert.
Too low terrain. 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 Too low terrain.
Number 2. Florida Flight 90. Larry, we are going down. I know it. There are avoidable tragedies, and then there is Air Florida Flight 90, a scheduled U.S. domestic passenger flight that was operating from Ronald Reagan National Airport and bound for Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, Florida, when it crashed. A couple of things contributed to the crash of Florida Flight 90. First, both pilots of Air Florida Flight 90 had little experience of flying in snowy conditions. Ice had built up on the wings and control surfaces of their plane, and somehow the captain chose not to turn on the engine's anti-icing feature. This happened while they were waiting for taxi clearance. Somehow he assumed that the heat from the engines would melt the snow and ice that had accumulated on their wings. It did not. Also, the captain ignored his second officer, who had noticed that something wasn't right. The engine temperature was much lower than normal. Instead of turning back and calling off the takeoff, the captain proceeded, and the aircraft struggled to gain height and never climbed higher than 352 feet. Eventually it crashed, striking the bridge which carries Interstate 395 between Washington, D.C. and Arlington County, Virginia. Only 4 passengers and a flight attendant were rescued from the crash and survived. In the moments before final impact, you can hear the cautionary voice of the first officer say to his captain, "Larry, we are going down." And you can hear the captain respond firmly, "I know it." Number 1. Good night. Goodbye. We perish. LOT Polish Airlines Flight 5055 was an international passenger flight from Warsaw, Poland, bound for San Francisco, with a stopover in New York City. In the late morning hours of May 9th, 1987, the LOT Polish Airlines Flight 5055, with 183 passengers and crew members on board, took off from Warsaw Chopin Airport. But unfortunately, the flight never left Poland because it crashed barely an hour after takeoff. An engine shaft exploded and disintegrated, and this led the flight into multiple catastrophic events, with the failure of the 2 left engines and an onboard fire, which destroyed all flight control systems. 30 minutes after the first engine had exploded, and after the pilot and the flight crew had tried and failed to salvage the plane, Flight 5055 crashed into the Kabety Woods Nature Reserve on the outskirts of Warsaw. The plane's black box later revealed that the flight crew had calmly discussed their options with air traffic control, and the decision was made to try to land in Warsaw, but the plane never made it. All 183 passengers and crew on board perished in the fatal crash, making it the deadliest aviation disaster in the history of Poland. In the final moments before the crash, the distressed captain can be heard frantically saying in Polish, "Good night, goodbye, we perish."